Genshin is a game that won't ever die, but as somebody who used to enjoy Genshin a lot, it's very frustrating to see that a game with so much potential that could be so good ended up not living up to its fullest potential, and over time actually degraded in quality. And after Natlan specifically, many people are quitting because that magic that COVID brought and the magic that came from some of the earlier regions just isn't there anymore. Natlan, many people thought was going to be a place with big changes for Genshin, where a lot of quality of life improvements could be made and the game would be changed for the better, but ultimately we only saw a little bit of these changes. We saw some quality of life, some improvements, a free 5-star, but unfortunately a lot of that stuff was 4 years too late, and it's something that a lot of other modern gacha games are starting to do. So it didn't end up coming off as something special, rather than just living up to the status quo we had seen in other gacha games already, even games that were actually made by Hoyoverse themselves, such as Honkai Star Rail and Kuro's Wuthering Waves. Now, first let's start by talking about where Genshin started. So Genshin actually came out, I believe, on September of 2020, so it's been about 4.5 years since its release, and its release was met with a decent amount of criticism. I remember there was some guy who even destroyed his PS4 over Genshin's release. It was met with a lot of Breath of the Wild clone sort of statements, people talking about this game is just a clone of Breath of the Wild and you're adding gacha to it with the predatory system. So a lot of people didn't actually like it, but in terms of the gacha space specifically, it was something that innovated the gacha space with insanely high potential, insanely high budget, and it said, we're going to take the gacha space to the next level. And without Genshin, we may not have gotten any open world gacha games. We probably still would have gotten some eventually, and that would have been the innovator of the gacha space. But Genshin really took the initiative to eld the gacha game industry into a more AAA gacha game focused thing, where people are focusing a lot on these very high budget gacha games. Now we've gotten games like HSR, Tower of Fantasy, Wuthering Waves, and ZZZ coming out that have already came out and already been pretty high budget. Even those games are a lot better than a lot of the old gacha games. I mean, if you just look at a game like FGO, it just looks absolutely terrible compared to these more modern gacha games that were inspired by Genshin. And these inspirations had an entirely new wave of gacha games to come after them. And as an innovator from the genre, it kind of just rode that wave, and it didn't keep innovating. And that's the big problem with Genshin. The games that are inspired by Genshin, have been inspired by Genshin, ultimately just ended up making Genshin look dated. It wasn't until the first gacha games started coming out that more and more Genshin could never and Genshin hate started arising. There was a couple of people before that were still criticizing Genshin quite a bit, but the Genshin hate didn't really start until HSR on a massive scale. And that's when you started to see a lot of YouTubers talking about the pros and the cons of Genshin and why it just wasn't living up to what it could. People would be very quick to criticize Genshin at the beginning for its lack of endgame, and that was the biggest thing that it was being criticized for quite a while. There were other problems with Genshin, and there are a lot of other problems with Genshin, but the lack of endgame content was really where things started. People said Spiral Abyss is too easy. People would beat Spiral Abyss with their eyes closed. They'd beat it with all 4-star characters. They would beat it in the most simple ways, and they would talk about how it was just boring and easy. And Hoyoverse's response to this was to just keep on adding more HP, more and more and more and more and more HP to these mobs, rather than making it more interesting, rather than making unique boss fights, rather than doing anything. It would just HP inflate things, and people did not like that. There were also other criticisms, especially about the dailies, about the weapon banner, about missing past 4-star event weapons like Festering Desire, which would end up being Farina's one of her best in slots, but people wouldn't be able to get it because you would have had to play in 1.1 during Albedo's story to be able to get it. It didn't have resin overflow like HSR did. It didn't have a dialogue skip button like some other games do. There was no artifact loadouts. People just didn't enjoy doing dailies. The events weren't interesting and would take too long. And these were a lot of the complaints that a lot of people would have about Genshin. But this was only the beginning, because we would eventually reach something that was catastrophic. The 3 pulls for 3 years incident. The 3 years for 3 pulls brought a lot of hate back to Genshin because it made Genshin look like they did not care about their players or appreciate the people who had been supporting their game for so long. 3 years you've been playing a game and all they can give you is a measly 3 pulls. There was a couple of other pulls on that as well. I believe it was a total of 13, but 13 pulls for a 3-year anniversary, that is the worst thing you've seen out of probably any gacha game. And out of all the gacha games I've played, I've never seen something even remotely close to that bad. So the outrage from the community was quite bad, and you saw this this being the rise of a lot of Hoyo hate channels specifically who would target and criticize Hoyo. Now, I think these channels ultimately have been pretty beneficial, not to Hoyoverse specifically, but to future gacha games coming out. Now, if a game is going to be getting a lot of hate, that is mainly going to signal to other developers, do not do this thing. Because if you do this thing, you are going to get a lot of hate like this company did. And rather than actually signaling something to Hoyo because Hoyo doesn't seem to listen, it's more of just helping other games understand what players' boundaries are and what they will actually respect in a gacha game. Because if you look at a game like HSR or Genshin specifically right now, these games, they already have secured pretty big audiences. So they can do dumb things all the time and not really have to face too many consequences for it. But if a new gacha game were to do that, that could be potentially game ruining and cause them to lose a large amount of their player base because they're not invested in the game yet. So when the 3 polls for 3 years banner came out, it showed if future gacha games want to actually be able to grow their audience, they're going to need to be more generous to the players to be able to pull them away. Because as a new gacha game, you're not just looking to be a good gacha game, you're looking to be better than the competition, better enough that you're pulling people away from their game. When people are already so invested in other games, it kind of makes it so that you have a much bigger responsibility to be better and to do the things that people actually want to see. And Genshin doesn't have to do anything. That is one of the big problems with Genshin and why Genshin is failing to innovate and improve. It's because they don't need to. And if they don't need to, then they don't want to. There's no need for them to improve. And when they did try to make some minor improvements, which they did during the 5.0 update, most people just didn't really care too much about the updates besides people who are actually playing Genshin. And we saw a lot of Genshin glaze. Wow, Genshin is making a free 5-star. Wow, absolutely insane. But you saw a lot of the more critical people saying, really? You're giving us a free 5-star now after everything that's happened? It's like, it kind of feels more like a slap in the face to do it so late. Because if you're doing something only when you're forced to do it, then there's no genuineness to it. It doesn't feel heartfelt. It doesn't feel like you're actually giving to it, right? It's feeling more like Hoyo was forced to give up this thing that they could have held on to because of the circumstances, right? It doesn't feel genuine. People will take the rewards, but it just doesn't feel sincere. It feels like, wow, thank you for supporting us all the way until 5.0. It feels so fake, and it honestly made a lot of people dislike the company more because the only way they would actually make improvements is if they had competition and they weren't willing to support the game normally. But even despite that, it did still generate a bit of goodwill, and missing quality of life features, if they were to be added, could actually generate quite a bit of goodwill for the company. So I'm going to just give some ideas on how to generate goodwill for the player base in terms of quality of life. And then after the quality of life, I'll talk about more major changes that can be added to make the new player experience better and to help the game get back on its feet. And these things can be done by other gacha games as well that are coming out in the future. And I think these are things that need to be done. So the first thing is the ability to buy previous 4-star event weapons. Now, HSR has this in the simulated universe. You can spend your little tokens and buy previous 4-star event weapons. Very good feature that allows players who miss certain light cones to be able to get them back. I played during 1.1, but I didn't do Silver Rose event because I didn't really care. And I ended up missing that weapon. You know, a big oversight on my part, but they added it back to the shop. And then I was able to get Silver Wolf's good weapon. And I was able to get her weapon as well as its refinements. Another thing is implementing a better weapon banner. Wuthering Waves has an amazing weapon banner. And I've even heard people talk about how they've quit other gacha games like ZZZ and HSR just because the weapon banner is so terrible. It is at 75-25, but if you lose one of those 75-25s, people are legit going to quit the game because of that. So just making a better weapon banner will also encourage more people to pull on weapon banners, right? Most people just in Genshin do not pull on weapons at all. The next thing you could do is have non-daily gated domains. This is the most annoying thing about Genshin in terms of leveling up characters. It's even worse than the artifact system. You can't even level up your talents for specific characters unless you do things on specific days. It's a very weird system and it doesn't really make that much sense. ZZZ, WUWA, HSR, pretty much every other gacha game, you don't need to wait for specific days to level up your characters. It just time gates things for no reason. It can make character releases annoying if you don't pre-farm because characters are usually released on like a Tuesday, so you might not even be able to farm the stuff you need for your character on the day you get your character, and it just makes it so much slower to level up talents. It's just overall not a good thing from the game. The next two things are kind of related, and it's not being able to craft things in your inventory, as well as having to go back to Catherine every single time you do your dailies. It just adds a bit of extra time, a bit of extra play time, I guess, and it doesn't really do anything beneficial. Just allow you to claim your dailies in your adventurer's handbook and allow you to craft stuff wherever you are on the map. If you have to go back to the crafting station every time you want to level something up, it can just take forever, and it's just better if you could just do it in your inventory like all of the other games in the big four. You can do this in ZZZ, you can do this in Wuthering Waves, you can do this in HSR. So just allow it, making a simple quality of life, just allowing people to craft stuff in their inventory. The next thing is going to be fixing the Chronicled Witch banner and fixing the weapon banners, because Chronicled Witch banner has no pity that carries over. And the only way to guarantee you get the character you want is just to have enough pulls, use all the pulls, and get the character. And if the banner goes away, no pity. It's just such a dumb thing. Just add more banners that are rotating in so that people can pull for more characters. The Chronicled banners are just not a good addition to the game at all. Next is fixing the weapon banner. And the weapon banner, the fate point design is just terrible. I mean, it's so much worse than the systems in HSR and ZZZ with the 75-25. If the 75-25, which is a weapon banner system that sucks, is better than your weapon system, then that shows that the weapon system has a problem. And Wuthering Waves, as we mentioned earlier, is just so much of a better system because you could just guarantee a weapon with 80 pulls. Please just make the weapon system better. It would cause more people to pull for weapons. Sure, you might lose some money on whales, but people would like this, and you could get a lot of your player base to start playing the game again if you made simple changes like the ones I'm listing out. Next, please add resin overflow. Every game besides Genshin has this. Wuthering Waves has this, HSR has this, ZZZ has this. You don't need to just not have resin overflow. It's such a simple thing to add, and if you do add it, please don't make it like Wuthering Waves. Wuthering Waves only having 480 overflow is kind of annoying. Please make it like 2000. Also, Wuthering Waves should make it 2000. I don't know why Wuthering Waves only has it as 480. It's stupid. At least 1000 minimum, preferably 2000. If you do 480, that's just stupid. Or if you do like 400, which is like double the resin amount, that's just dumb. Okay, please make it at least a decent amount. The next important thing, if not one of the most important things, is the dialogue skip option. If you're not going to do it for main quest, at least do it for side quest. And if you don't do it for main quest, I don't get why. You want to increase player retention, half of these players are just going to leave it on auto anyway, so you're not really getting much out of it, or they're just going to spam skip through it. Also, another thing about Genshin is one of the few games where you can't really spam click through stuff because it has cutscenes like everywhere in the like minor cutscene kind of things in the dialogue, so you can't really spam through it. If you compare it to like ZZZ, in ZZZ you could just spam click through everything. You can get through some of the stories pretty fast just by just spam clicking, even if there was the skip button. HSR kind of has that, but Genshin, you cannot spam click through things because it kind of just locks you, and it'll like, okay, you have to wait 3 seconds before you can click again to spam through the next one, and it's just a bunch of waiting even if you wanted to spam through the quest, which is dumb. Okay, just add a skip button, make it so you could skip through stuff a lot easier. Also make it so that you could go back if you accidentally skipped too far. You know, provide some safety nets for those who are actually playing this story so that they don't skip too far ahead. These might seem like, well, why would you add a thing where you could skip back? Isn't that just for dumb people? Well, no. I mean, it's just kind of covering all your bases, and it's not a hard thing to add either, so just do it. Next, artifact loadouts are something that Hoyoverse legitimately seems to be allergic to, except in Honkai Impact 3rd they did have them, if I'm remembering correctly. And also WoWa has this, so your competition has this, you might as well add it. Wow, it's going to decrease your player retention because people are spending an obscene amount of time switching artifacts. People shouldn't have to spend like 10 minutes in their artifact like inventory switching stuff before doing Spiral Abyss. Just allow people to do it a lot faster. There's no reason not to add this. It's not a hard thing to add either. This next one is one of the main reasons I don't play Genshin, and it is then the daily system sucks. I think that out of all of the gacha games I've ever played, and I've played probably around like 15-20 gacha games, I haven't played as many as like a lot of people, but these dailies in Genshin are some of the worst I've ever played. And the fate point system, it does do some stuff to make it better, but you have to do like, you do an entire story quest and you get like 2 days of like dailies, 2 days for doing like an entire story quest. It just doesn't make that much sense. And it's meant to encourage exploration and stuff like that, but it's just dumb. I mean, the dailies also, like the daily quests, if you were to do them, they just take forever. It just keeps you into some quests, which like, oh, you have to do this quest for a daily, and there's no dialogue skip, so you're just stuck in dialogue for like 10 minutes, and it's like, these dailies just take forever compared to a lot of other games. And also, I think it could be beneficial, especially for like artifacts farming. Just make it so you could spend like 80 at a time or like more stamina. Wuthering Waves does this, and it's one of the nicest things that Wuthering Waves did. So I would like to see this in Genshin as well, just so you could do your dailies faster. Do your dailies, auto auto claim, not have to talk to Catherine, get off. It would just make it so much smoother to do dailies. And I actually like building characters in Genshin. I do quite like interacting with the artifact system, but I have not farmed in Genshin and done my dailies since like 4.4 or something, or like over a year, because it is just a pain in the ass to do it daily. Next thing, I want them to add permanent events. There are a lot of events that people just end up missing. Maybe you don't have time, but that shouldn't really be an issue, right? If people want to miss an event, don't have so much FOMO that you're like, you need to do the event now or never. I feel like the FOMO that they're enforcing with events is just too much. It's allowing people to do important story events, specifically important story quests, whenever. You can cut the rewards pretty much out of it, allow people to do old story quests, allow people to do old events, keep some of the event rewards, maybe half them or something for the event rewards, and then for old story quests, you can just give no rewards, right? And also, like I mentioned earlier, the ability to buy 4-star weapons, maybe just make it so that if you do the story, the old story, you can get the 4-star weapons. Like, you don't need to remove these stories from the game completely. Have a separate screen where you could download the story and then do it, and then it deletes it after. That way you could save on storage issues as well. There are so many things you could do that are just better, right? That would improve the player experience and improve engagement with the game, right? The more you have your consumers engage with the game, the more they'll like the game, right? But you're doing it in a toxic way right now. So try and do it in a better way where you can have players encouraged to play the game. The last thing is focusing way too heavily on the new player experience and providing poor endgame. Imaginarium Theater is not what people meant when they wanted more endgame. I have talked to a lot of people who play Genshin. I have a lot of friends who still play it, and none of them enjoy the endgame. Everyone is just more on the casual side. They said, yeah, I used to do the endgame, but it's so shit that I just don't do it anymore. They just do the story, they explore, have a bit of a fun time, and then just get off the game. That's what most of the people who play Genshin that I know actually play Genshin for. They don't play for the endgame. I think it's bad, very highly inflated in terms of HP. That is something that people have complained about a lot too. You just gotta fix the endgame experience, or if you really want to stay in the casual game, don't fix the endgame experience, but just make it so that people who are in later stages of the game can have more to interact with, more enjoyable things to do, rather than just, oh, this shitty endgame where the boss has like 16 billion HP and you can't even kill it because you don't have enough artifacts and because you didn't C6 the character that you needed to. Spiral of Abyss specifically is still pretty easy to clear up until like the last time I played, which was around like 4.5, but nowadays I'm not sure if that's the same, and I've heard people complaining about the Night Soul's Blessing mechanic in certain like shields. Like, you can't destroy the shield unless you have Burning or Night Soul's Blessing, and that's just like, you're kind of forcing people to use weird teams, which I get in a way. You want to force people to sort of try out new teams and try out new content, but maybe save that for floor 13 or 14, okay? Maybe let's add a floor 13 and 14 with very strict team requirements, and then just, have it so that the casual players can do up to 12, but they can still get their rewards and stuff. All in all, Genshin, even with a lot of these quality of life changes, if they were to add all of them, there's still a lot more they could do, but this is just like a small list of things, because if I'm going to be saying that Genshin is outdated, of course I gotta say, okay, well, Genshin's outdated now, here's how it can catch up to a lot of the other gacha games and start in terms of quality of life. But there's a lot more things that Genshin needs to do than just improving their quality of life if they want to get a lot of their players back. Because to get players back from like a game like Wuthering Waves, they have to be better than Wuthering Waves. To get their players back from ZZZ, they have to do better than ZZZ. Get their players back from HSR, they got to do better than HSR. So this might not even be enough to bring a lot of their players back. However, it would be a step in the right direction, and it would actually provide a lot of their players with a lot more trust in the game, right? That the game is listening to them. And when you feel like a company is just not listening to you and the stuff that you have to say, it just feels terrible as a player to play the game, and it makes it so that you don't want to play it as much. That's all I really wanted to talk about today in terms of the Genshin experience, and how Genshin has kind of never learned from their mistakes. They have made so many mistakes and just never really learned or improved upon them. And I think Genshin as a game started so far ahead. It started with like a 10-mile lead in a half marathon, right? Only 3 miles left to go. And then it got surpassed by games that came after it, which I think is just very disappointing as a game that had so much potential to not live up to that potential. And I wish to see Genshin improve and do better in the future, but with how weird Natlan was and how immersion breaking Natlan was, I don't think they're going to be able to get a lot of people back during the Natlan patch. Maybe during Snezhnaya, a lot of people will come back if they can skip the Natlan story, but Natlan is just such a weird immersion break from the fantasy story that I feel like a lot of people didn't like. I've heard a lot of people complain about it specifically. So to want people to come back, do Snezhnaya and do it well. Go back to the fantasy. Fantasy is why people started playing the game in the first place, and Genshin can get a lot of these people back if they go back to their roots, but in the best way possible. Go back to your roots of being a fantasy game and take these things from these other games. Become an innovator in the genre again. That is what Genshin needs to do if it wants to soar back up to the top. So that's it for today's video. Our next video will be a more positive video. I'll probably be talking about the success of some other gacha games and about future gacha games, looking into a more insightful and like hopeful future on what the gacha genre could become, because I have seen a lot of good gacha games recently, right? We've seen Wuthering Waves. I've been enjoying Infinity Nikki as well. I mean, ZZZ I still play occasionally and I do enjoy it, but I also think because of Hoya versus Pass, it's kind of hard for ZZZ to come back up. I will be making more videos talking about those sort of topics. So if you want to see more positive content, I will be making more positive content, but there will also be more critique content because I feel like that is what the gacha scene kind of needs right now. It needs more critiquing than ever because the gacha scene, in terms of a lot of the old games with Genshin and HSR, are kind of in a negative state. So with that, I will see you guys later.